The day Grace Ramsey rolled into Dusty Creek Valley with nothing but a wagon, a battered trunk, and a coffee pot that had survived 3 states and 1 failed marriage, every soul in town had only one piece of advice for her: do not go near the Garrison property. She heard it from the livery man who unhitched her horse with a pitying expression. She heard it from the general store owner who sold her flour, salt, and a box of matches. She heard it from old Mabel Hutchins, who planted herself in the middle of the dusty main street and gripped Grace's wrist with bony fingers and said, with absolute conviction, that Gilbert Garrison was the devil's own neighbor and possibly something worse. The women of the church quilting circle, who had gathered on the porch of the seamstress shop to watch the newcomer arrive, nodded their bonneted heads in collective agreement. Whatever else the valley of Dusty Creek might offer a woman starting over in the autumn of 1882, it apparently did not offer a friendly neighbor to the north. Grace Ramsey had heard worse things in her 31 years on this earth. She thanked old Mabel for the warning, gathered her skirts, and drove her wagon up the dirt road that curved past the grove of cottonwood trees toward the 2 properties that sat side by side on the gentle rise above the valley floor. The smaller of the 2, a modest adobe and timber house with a sagging porch and a well that she prayed still worked, had been left to her by her late Uncle Clarence, a man she had met exactly twice, and who had apparently thought more kindly of her than anyone else in her life. The larger, sturdier property next door, with its dark-painted barn and its fence posts driven into the earth like a warning, belonged to Gilbert Garrison. She noticed that every window on his side of the fence was shuttered closed. She did not pay it much mind. She had a porch to shore up, a well to test, and approximately 7 months of winter supplies to organize before the first hard frost came down off the mountains. She had not traveled from Missouri to New Mexico territory to stand around worrying about shuttered windows. The well worked. That felt like a good omen. She spent her first 2 days unpacking, scrubbing, and making the small house livable. She patched a gap in the kitchen wall with newspaper and clay. She hauled her uncle's old furniture back into sensible arrangements and hung the yellow curtains she had sewn herself on the long road west. She planted herself in the valley with the quiet, deliberate energy of a woman who had no intention of being moved again. On the morning of her 3rd day in Dusty Creek, she built a proper fire in the cast iron stove, ground her coffee beans with the hand grinder she'd carried since Kansas, and brewed the first decent pot of coffee she'd had since leaving Missouri. She stood on her front porch with her tin cup warming both palms, watching the early light fall golden over the valley below, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for a very long time. She was so absorbed in the quiet and the coffee that she almost didn't notice the figure standing at the fence line. Almost. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that had seen better years and a hat pulled low against the morning chill. He was not looking at her. He was looking out across the valley with the expression of a man who owned whatever view he was studying, even if the law said otherwise. His jaw was dark with several days of beard. His hands, resting on the top fence rail, were large and scarred across the knuckles. Grace Ramsey was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was a woman who observed carefully. She watched him for a moment. He did not look at her. She called out across the fence, "Good morning." He turned then slowly, the way a man turns when he has decided in advance not to be surprised by anything the world offers. His eyes were dark, the color of creek water in deep shade, and they settled on her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not hostility exactly. It was closer to the look a person gives something unexpected, something that does not fit into any category they have already prepared. "Morning," he said. The word came out flat and careful like a coin set on a counter. "I'm Grace Ramsey. I've taken the Clarence Whitfield property." He looked at her for another moment. "I know who you are. Then you have the advantage of me. Gilbert Garrison." He said it without warmth and without apology, the way a man states a fact he has long since stopped being troubled by. "Mr. Garrison," Grace said, "would you like to come over for coffee?" The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. He stared at her across the fence with those dark, unreadable eyes, and she stared back with the particular calm of a woman who has already been through enough that a neighbor's discomfort barely registers as a problem. "No," he said. "All right," she said easily. "The offer stands whenever you want it." She went back inside and refilled her cup. She found out about Gilbert Garrison's reputation in pieces. The way you find out most things in a small valley where people have opinions they are barely restraining from sharing. The liveryman, whose name was Pete Dudley, explained it to her while she was arranging for her horse to board during the coldest months. Pete was a compact, weathered man of about 50 who seemed to genuinely enjoy talking, and he laid the story out with the careful pleasure of someone who had told it before but still found it satisfying. Gilbert Garrison, Pete explained, had come to Dusty Creek Valley about 6 years back, in 1876. He'd bought the northern property from old Henry Mast, who'd been trying to sell it for 2 seasons. Garrison had arrived alone, without family or history that anyone could account for, and he'd set about building up his cattle operation with a focused intensity that the valley's other ranchers found unsettling. In the first year, he'd had a dispute with Thomas Aldrich, who ran the largest spread in the valley, over water rights on the creek that ran along the eastern edge of both their properties. The dispute had gone legal, which was practically unheard of in Dusty Creek, and Garrison had won it in the territorial court in Santa Fe. Thomas Aldrich had not forgiven him. Then there was the business with the schoolmaster, Pete continued, lowering his voice slightly even though they were alone in the livery. The schoolmaster, a man named Beckwith, had been running a scheme where he charged families more for their children's schooling than the county had authorized, pocketing the difference. Garrison had noticed the discrepancy, calculated the overcharges to the penny, and taken the documentation to the county seat. Beckwith had been removed. But Beckwith had a sister married to the Methodist preacher, and the preacher had a congregation, and the congregation had opinions, and somehow the story had transformed in the retelling until it was Garrison who seemed like the villain for bringing it forward at all. And then, Pete said, there was just the matter of the man himself. He didn't come to social functions. He didn't attend church. He didn't participate in the collective cattle drives or the harvest festivals, or any of the small communal rituals that stitched a valley together. He traded fairly at the general store, paid his accounts on time, and otherwise lived as though the rest of Dusty Creek Valley did not particularly concern him, which Grace understood was its own kind of offense in a small community. People will forgive a man a great deal, but they will rarely forgive him for not needing them. "He's not a violent man?" Grace asked. Pete seemed to think about this honestly. "No more than the country requires," he finally said, which Grace took as a reasonable answer for 1882 New Mexico territory. She thanked Pete, paid her boarding fee, and walked back up the hill to her property with a clearer picture of her neighbor taking shape in her mind. She thought about Gilbert Garrison the way she thought about most puzzles, with a steady, patient attention that she'd learned from years of making do with what was available rather than what she wished for. She had grown up in rural Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who kept a kitchen garden, and a household running on very little with extraordinary efficiency. Grace had inherited her father's mind and her mother's hands, and the combination had served her reasonably well even through the difficult years of her marriage to Edward Ramsey, a charming man from St. Louis who had turned out to be considerably better at being charming than at anything else, and who had left her 4 years ago for California, and presumably someone who found his charm less exhausting. The divorce had been quiet and shameful and enormously clarifying. Her father had died the year after, leaving her with a small inheritance that she'd spent carefully, and then her Uncle Clarence's unexpected bequest had arrived like a door opening in a wall she'd thought was solid. So here she was. 31 years old, in possession of a house and 12 acres and a good strong coffee pot, starting over in a place where nobody knew her story yet. She found she did not mind being starting over. She minded far more the idea of being told how to do it. She tried the coffee invitation again 4 days later, calling it across the fence in a pleasant, unhurried voice when she spotted Gilbert Garrison near his barn in the early morning. He was carrying a wooden bucket, heading toward the water trough, and he paused when she spoke. "I've got a good pot on," she said. "I grind the beans fresh." He set the bucket down on the fence rail and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of considering something seriously. "You're going to keep asking," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am," she confirmed pleasantly. "Why?" She thought about it for a moment. "Because you're my neighbor and it's neighborly, because I make very good coffee, and because everyone in this valley has told me to avoid you, which means you're either actually dangerous, which I don't believe, or you're just someone people have decided they don't need to understand, which seems lonely." He was quiet for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was deciding something internal and important. "Half an hour," he finally said. "I've got stock to tend." "Half an hour is plenty," Grace said. He came through the gate in the fence at exactly the time he'd implied, having apparently cleaned up with some care, the beard trimmed back and the dark coat brushed. He removed his hat at the door, which she noticed and appreciated, and he stepped into her kitchen with the careful movements of a large man in an unfamiliar space, taking in the yellow curtains and the neatly organized shelves and the herbs hanging to dry from the ceiling beam, with an expression that was carefully neutral but not unkind. She poured the coffee. He wrapped his scarred hands around the tin cup and took a careful sip, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face, some small degree of tension releasing. "That is good coffee," he said. "I told you," she said, and she smiled at him, and he looked at the smile for a moment the way a person looks at something they weren't expecting to encounter and are not quite sure what to do with. They talked for 37 minutes by the clock on her shelf, which she tracked not because she was counting, but because she noticed when he pushed back his chair and set down his cup. He asked about her journey from Missouri. She told him honestly, including the parts that weren't graceful. He listened with the focused attention of a man who was not in the habit of half-listening to things, and she found herself talking more freely than she had with most people, because his attention felt like something being offered rather than something being taken. She asked him how his cattle operation ran, and he explained it with the same focused honesty, the breeding program he was working on, the trouble with the eastern creek in dry years, the fence line he needed to extend before spring. He spoke about the land as though he genuinely cared about it, not just as property, but as something alive that he had a responsibility toward. When he left, he said, "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Ramsey." "Mrs.," she said, and then immediately corrected herself because old habits die slowly and she was still adjusting to being a divorced woman in a world that did not quite have a comfortable word for her. "Actually, Miss is fine. I'm widowed in the eyes of most people who don't know the full story, and I find it simpler." He looked at her with those dark, still eyes, and he nodded once, accepting this without question or judgment, which was, she thought, an extremely good quality in a neighbor. "Thank you for the coffee, Miss Ramsey," he said again. "Come back whenever you like," she told him. He came back the following Tuesday. Then again on Thursday. Within 3 weeks, it had become something that might have been called a habit if either of them had been the sort to name things before they were ready to be named. He came over most mornings when weather and work allowed, usually in that particular window after the first chores and before the day's heavier labor, and she had the coffee ready because she noticed patterns and she liked having them ready. They talked. Sometimes for half an hour, sometimes for nearly 2 hours if neither of them had pressing business. She learned things about Gilbert Garrison in pieces, the way the full picture of a person is always revealed in pieces rather than all at once. He was 35 years old. He had grown up in Kansas, the son of a farmer who had worked himself to death on land that never quite yielded enough. He had spent several years working as a ranch hand across 3 territories before saving enough to purchase his own land, and the Dusty Creek property had been exactly what he could afford and approximately what he wanted. He had no family that he spoke of with any current presence, only a brother somewhere in Colorado whom he mentioned once and did not elaborate on. He had a dry, careful humor that revealed itself rarely and always when she was not expecting it. A deadpan observation slipped into an otherwise serious statement that made her suddenly and helplessly laugh. And the first time it happened, she looked up to find him watching her laughter with an expression she could not name, but that made her chest do something complicated. He began to look at her. She noticed the way a person looks at something they are trying to memorize without being caught memorizing it. When she turned to find him watching, he would look away with no particular hurry but no acknowledgement either, as though he had simply been looking in the general direction of wherever she happened to be standing. She began to look at him too, with the same careful attention she brought to everything that interested her. She noticed the way his hands moved when he talked about something he cared about, the contained but unmistakable animation in them. She noticed the way he went still when he was listening, a quality of attention so complete it was almost physical. She noticed that he always held the door for her horse when they were both in the barn checking on the animals on cold mornings, and that he had repaired the hinge on her gate one afternoon without being asked and without mentioning it, so that she only knew it was him because the work had the same quality of quiet competence he brought to everything. The town of Dusty Creek noticed the visits. Of course it did. A town of 400 and some souls in a valley, 15 miles long, notices everything that happens and arranges it into a narrative within about 2 days. Grace became aware of the noticing primarily through old Mabel Hutchins, who appeared at her door one afternoon with a jar of preserved peaches and a face full of barely contained concern. "People are talking," Mabel said, settling herself at Grace's kitchen table with the authority of a woman who had been sitting at other women's kitchen tables and delivering uncomfortable news for 60 years. "People generally do," Grace said, pouring coffee and taking the jar of peaches with genuine pleasure because she liked peaches and she had not had preserved fruit since Missouri. "About you and Garrison. We've had coffee together several times," Grace said. "He's my neighbor." Mabel looked at her the way older women look at younger women who are being deliberately simple. "Grace, honey, that man has not set foot in anyone's home in this valley in 6 years. He doesn't come to church. He doesn't come to the harvest dance. He doesn't come to the 4th of July gathering or the Christmas service or any of it. And now he's coming to your kitchen most mornings." "He likes the coffee," Grace said mildly. "He likes something," Mabel said, with the particular emphasis of a woman who means exactly what she implies. Grace was quiet for a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "What do you know about the water rights dispute?" she asked. "The one with Thomas Aldrich." Mabel's expression shifted slightly. "What about it? Was Garrison right about the water rights?" A longer pause. "The territorial court said he was. And the school fees matter with Beckwith." Mabel looked at her cup. "Children were being overcharged. So he was right about that too." "Being right," Mabel said carefully, "is not always the same as being easy to live alongside." "No," Grace agreed. "But it's not the same as being bad either." Mabel left an hour later with the particular expression of a woman who came to deliver a warning and found herself, somewhere in the conversation, less certain of what she was warning against. Grace watched her go down the road and felt something settle in her chest with a quiet conviction she recognized as certainty. She was not afraid of Gilbert Garrison. She was, if she was being fully honest with herself in the clear morning light of her own kitchen, becoming quite fond of him in a way that was outgrowing the category of neighborly. The first indication that Gilbert Garrison might feel something similar came on a Thursday morning in late October, when the temperature had dropped sharply overnight, and Grace woke to find the early frost had crept into the gap in her north-facing wall that she had patched, but apparently not patched well enough. She was wrestling with a board and some fresh clay when he appeared at her door without the usual ritual of crossing the fence and knocking, which meant he had noticed from his side that something was wrong. "What happened?" he said, looking at the gap in the frost crystals. "The clay dried wrong," she said. "I need to replace the board." He looked at the board, looked at the gap, and said, "I've got better lumber. Let me get it." "I can manage," she said, though her fingers were stiff with cold. He looked at her stiff fingers and then at her face. "I know you can," he said, "but let me get the lumber." There was something in the way he said it, without condescension, and without the particular brand of male certainty that she found exhausting, that made her step back and let him go. He returned with good pine planks from his barn, and spent an hour working on the north wall with a focused competence that she watched from the kitchen doorway with her coffee cup in both hands, and a feeling building in her chest that was warm and complicated and distinct from the coffee. When he was done, the wall was solid in a way it had probably never been under her uncle's ownership. He gathered his tools and turned to find her watching him, and for a moment they were simply looking at each other in the thin autumn light, close enough that she could see the detail of the scar that ran along his left jawline, a story she had not yet asked about. "Thank you," she said. "Your north wall was going to give you trouble all winter," he said. "I know. I was going to deal with it." "I know you were." She asked because she was suddenly curious and because the closeness of the moment made asking feel natural. "How did you get the scar?" "On your jaw." He touched it briefly with 2 fingers, the gesture of someone who sometimes forgets it's there and is reminded. "Working cattle in Texas," he said. "Wire fence, bad horse, combination of poor judgment and bad luck. I was 23 and did not fully understand my own limitations." She smiled at that. "And now, I have a more complete understanding of my limitations," he said, and his mouth curved at the corner just slightly in the way that she had learned was his version of a real smile. "Though the fence still got me." She laughed, and he watched her laugh with that expression again, the one she was coming to understand as him feeling something he did not entirely know what to do with. "Come inside," she said. "The coffee's still hot." He came inside. It was in November, about 6 weeks after Grace's arrival in Dusty Creek Valley, that the trouble with Thomas Aldrich escalated into something that touched her directly. Aldrich was a big man of about 50, with a prosperous spread, and the disposition of someone who had been accommodated by the world for long enough to genuinely believe the world owed him accommodation. He had 4 sons who worked his ranch and shared his outlook, and he had quietly dominated the social and commercial life of Dusty Creek for 15 years before Gilbert Garrison's legal challenge over the water rights had introduced the unsettling idea that Aldrich could be opposed. Grace encountered Aldrich at the general store on a cold Tuesday morning. She was buying lamp oil and a new pair of work gloves, and he was behind the counter talking to the store owner, a nervous little man named Horace, when she came in. Aldrich looked her over with the frank assessment of a man who does not consider this impolite, and he introduced himself with a handshake that lasted a beat too long. "You've taken the Whitfield place," he said. "I have," Grace said. "Good land up there," he said. "Pity it's adjacent to the Garrison property. Must be uncomfortable, having a man like that as your nearest neighbor." "I find it quite comfortable, actually," Grace said pleasantly. "He's a good neighbor." Aldrich's expression shifted slightly. "He told you that himself, did he?" "I formed the opinion independently," Grace said, with the particular calm of a woman who knows exactly what she's doing. "Mr. Aldrich, I need my lamp oil." She felt his gaze on her back as she moved to the lamp oil barrel, and she heard the low murmur of his voice to Horace as she filled her can, and she did not turn around. She paid and left with her gloves and her oil, and she walked up the hill road in the cold, clear air with a precise awareness that she had just made Thomas Aldrich's list of people who annoyed him, and that this was likely to have consequences. The consequences came 2 weeks later, in the form of a surveyor who appeared at her fence line claiming that there was a question about the exact boundaries of the Whitfield property. implying that a portion of her eastern acreage might technically fall within Aldrich's land grant. Grace knew enough about land law and her uncle's will to know this was almost certainly nonsense. But she also knew that nonsense backed by money and social influence could become extremely inconvenient. She told the surveyor to come back with the original territorial survey documents and then went directly next door. She found Gilbert Garrison in his barn, doing something careful and competent with a piece of harness leather. He looked up when she appeared in the barn doorway, and something in her face made him set the leather down. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. He listened with his complete, still attention, and when she was finished he was quiet for a moment that she was learning to recognize as him organizing his thoughts rather than his reluctance to speak. "Aldrich sent the surveyor," he said. It was not a question. "I assumed so. He's done this before. He pushed a similar claim against the Mendez family 3 years ago, their 40 acres on the south end." "What happened to the Mendez family?" "They sold," Gilbert said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, controlled and contained but present. "They were a family with children and limited resources, and Aldrich made it expensive and uncomfortable enough that selling was easier than fighting." "I'm not going to sell," Grace said. He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, and she could not tell if it was an observation or an agreement, but either way it settled something between them. "You'll need the original survey documents. Do you have them?" "In my uncle's trunk. I haven't gone through all of it yet." "Go through it tonight. Every survey document, every deed, every letter from the Territorial Land Office. Bring me whatever you find and I'll tell you what's useful." She looked at him. "You know land law." "I know enough," he said. "I had to learn it." He picked up the harness leather again, then set it down. "Aldrich tried something similar with me 2 years after I arrived. He claimed my northern fence line was 8 feet over the boundary into his property. The original survey proved him wrong to the inch. He didn't give up easily, I expect." "No," Gilbert said, with that flat, quiet certainty she was coming to understand was his version of a complete account of something difficult. She went through her uncle's trunk that night by lamplight, organizing everything with the methodical patience of her schoolteacher father's daughter. She found the original territorial survey, dated 1871, with boundaries clear and specific. She found the deed of transfer to Clarence Whitfield in her uncle's shaky handwriting signature, properly recorded with the Territorial Land Office. She found 3 letters from the Land Office confirming the property's status. Everything was in order and everything was documented. She brought them to Gilbert in the morning. He spread them on his kitchen table, which was the first time she had been inside his house, and she looked around with quick, observant eyes while he studied the documents. His kitchen was spare and clean, with none of the feminine touches that made her softer, but it was organized in a way that spoke to the same quality of orderly thought she'd noticed in everything he did. There were books on a shelf by the door, which surprised her pleasantly. A lot of books, actually, for a man who lived alone in a ranch house in New Mexico territory. Histories, she could see from the spines, and a surveying manual, and what looked like a volume on cattle breeding. "These are solid," he said, looking up from the documents. "The survey is clear, the deed is recorded. Aldrich's claim is going to fall apart the moment anyone with territorial authority looks at these. Will he push it to that point?" "He might," Gilbert said. "He has the resources to make the process uncomfortable even if he can't win it. He'll try to make it expensive and slow." Grace looked at the documents on his table and felt the particular tiredness of a woman who has dealt with men who have resources using those resources to make things difficult for people with less. "What would you do?" He looked at her with those dark eyes. "Write to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe directly. Enclose certified copies of everything. Request a formal confirmation of your boundaries on record. That way if he files anything, you're already ahead of it." He paused. "I know a lawyer in Santa Fe who handled my water rights case. He's honest and his fees are reasonable." "You'd recommend him?" "I'd recommend him for you specifically, yes." There was something in the specifically that she looked at for a moment, and he seemed aware of it too, because he looked back at the documents with a deliberate attention that might have been slightly more deliberate than the documents strictly required. "I'll write the letter today," she said, "and contact your lawyer. I'll write you a letter of introduction if it would help. Carson knows my name, whatever the Valley thinks of it." "That would be very kind," she said, and she meant it, and when she looked up from saying it, she found him looking at her with the memorizing expression again, unguarded for just a moment, and she held it with a steady, open gaze rather than looking away. The letter to the land office went out on the next courier. Gilbert wrote her a letter of introduction to the lawyer Carson in Santa Fe. Within 3 weeks, she had received formal documentation confirming her boundary lines, registered with the territorial office, and a polite but firm letter from Carson to Aldrich's lawyer, indicating that any claim against the Whitfield-Ramsey property was without merit and would be contested vigorously. Aldrich's surveyor did not return, but the episode had shifted something between Grace and Gilbert, had put them on the same side of something in a way that felt significant. She noticed that he began to stay longer in the mornings. She noticed that she began to find reasons to walk along the fence line in the late afternoon when she knew he was working in the near pasture. She noticed these things with the clarity of a woman who has been honest with herself for long enough that she can see her own feelings as they arrive rather than only after they've already settled in. December came to Dusty Creek Valley with its particular beauty and its particular severity. The mountains went white above the valley, and the cold settled in with a permanence that changed the quality of every day. Grace learned the rhythms of a New Mexico winter, which were different from Missouri winters in ways she found genuinely interesting rather than difficult. The light was extraordinary. On clear days, the sky was a blue so saturated it looked painted, and the snow on the peaks caught the low winter sun and threw it back in colors she had never seen before. She began making supper for two without making a decision about it. It happened gradually and naturally, the way she had more stew on the stove than she could eat, and Gilbert was working on the fence between their properties, and she simply opened the door and told him there was enough for two if he wanted to come in out of the cold. He came in. He stayed for supper, and for the hour afterward during which they sat at either end of her small kitchen table and talked in the warm light of the lamp. And when he left, walking back through the gate between their properties in the cold darkness, she stood in her doorway and watched him go and felt a specific ache that she recognized from novels and from memory as a feeling she had not thought she would feel again. She was in love with him. She recognized it with a clear, unfrightened honesty that felt like the most natural thing she had done in years. Not the giddy, uncritical love of her youth, not the desperate, accommodating love of her marriage, but something steadier and surer, built on actual knowledge of an actual person, on the specific and irreplaceable reality of Gilbert Garrison as he actually was. She did not immediately tell him. She had been married to a man who said things before he meant them, and she had learned to value the weight of things said at the right time. Christmas in Dusty Creek Valley brought a town gathering at the church hall that Grace attended because she believed in participating in communities she lived in, even communities that were still sorting out how to receive her. She wore her good wool dress, the deep blue one that had survived the journey from Missouri in surprisingly good condition, and she arrived to find the hall decorated with pine boughs and candles, and the particular festive warmth of a small community gathered against the winter dark. She was welcomed with the guarded warmth of people who were not yet sure about her but were trying. She talked to young women with children on their hips. She talked to the new schoolmaster, a much younger and apparently honest man named Davies who had replaced the disgraced Beckwith, and who had a gentle, earnest quality that made her like him immediately. She ate the communal pie and drank the hot cider and smiled at people who were still learning her name. She noticed, with a precise awareness she did not attempt to suppress, that Gilbert Garrison was not there. Of course he was not there. In 6 years, she had been told, he had not come to any of it. She left the Christmas gathering at 9 o'clock. The night was cold and clear and brilliant with stars, the kind of star-filled darkness that the West offered in a way Missouri never had. And she walked home up the hill road with her lantern and her breath making clouds and her mind moving quietly toward what she felt and what she intended to do about it. There was a light in his window. Just the one in the kitchen. She stood at her gate for a moment looking at it across the dark fence line, and then, before she could think about it too carefully, she walked over to his door and knocked. There was a pause that suggested genuine surprise. Then footsteps, and the door opened and he was there in his shirt sleeves and without his coat, with a book in his hand and a look on his face that moved quickly from surprise to something more careful. "Miss Ramsey," he said. "I just came from the Christmas gathering," she said. "I thought you might like company." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the layers of that statement. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold," he said. His kitchen was warm with the wood stove burning low and the lamp on the table casting everything in amber light. She sat where she usually sat in her own kitchen, and he made coffee with the competent, quiet efficiency she had observed him apply to everything. And they sat across from each other in the warm silence, and she looked at him and thought with perfect clarity that she was done waiting. "Gilbert," she said, and using his first name for the first time was deliberate, and she watched him notice it. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it without immediately looking for an exit." Something moved behind his eyes, a wariness and a different thing beneath the wariness, something older and more careful. "All right," he said. "I think you're the most interesting and the most honest person I have met in a very long time," she said. "And I think I have been falling in love with you since approximately the second morning you came for coffee. And I am telling you this because I believe in being direct about important things, and because it seems to me that you feel something similar and are not sure what to do with it." The silence that followed was enormous and still and somehow not frightening. He looked at her across the table with those dark, careful eyes, and she watched the wariness work its way through several emotions in sequence, surprise and something like resistance, and then something that was not any version of resistance at all, something that looked almost like relief. "I don't know how to be someone's anything," he said. "I've been on my own a long time." "I know," she said. "So have I. I'm not easy to be near." "I've been near you for 2 months," she said. "I find it quite easy." "Most people in this valley, I am not most people in this valley," she said firmly. "And I am not asking you to be different than you are. I'm telling you that I like who you are." He looked at her for a long time. The stove ticked. The cold pressed against the windows and could not get in. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, his big scarred hand covering her smaller one, and the warmth of it went straight through her. "I don't have a great deal of experience with being liked," he said, and the honesty in it was so complete and so undefended that it made her throat ache. "You'll adjust," she said softly. He turned her hand over in his and looked at it as though reading something there. "I have thought about you," he said, "more than is probably practical, since the first morning you called across the fence. And what did you think?" "That you were the most direct person I had ever encountered," he said. "That your coffee was extraordinary, that I did not know what to do about either fact." She laughed softly in the warm kitchen, and he watched her laugh, and this time when he did, he smiled back, a full and actual smile, not just the corner of his mouth but the whole of it, and she thought she had not seen anything she liked more in a very long time. "Stay for supper," he said. "I've got a pot of venison stew on the back burner that's been keeping since this afternoon." "I'll stay for supper," she said. They sat together in his warm kitchen and ate the venison stew and talked for 3 hours, and when she finally said she should go home, he walked her to the gate in the cold, clear night and stood there while she went through it, and before she latched it she turned back to look at him. "Merry Christmas, Gilbert," she said. "Merry Christmas, Grace," he said, and her name in his voice was something new and entirely right, and she carried it home with her like a lamp. January arrived with the kind of cold that makes the world seem reduced to its essentials, and Grace and Gilbert moved into the new year with the natural ease of two people who had acknowledged something true, and were now finding their way into what it meant. He came for coffee in the mornings, and she went next door in the afternoons, and they ate supper together more evenings than not, alternating between her kitchen and his, each of them cooking well enough in their different styles that every shared meal was its own small pleasure. He kissed her for the first time in the middle of January, on a Sunday afternoon when they were walking along the eastern fence of her property, checking the posts for the winter damage she'd been meaning to assess. It was cold and the sky was the deep winter blue, and they were standing at the corner post debating the merit of wood versus iron posts for the rocky soil there. And somehow in the middle of the debate, they were standing very close together, and she had turned to make a point, and found him looking at her with the full force of his attention, and the conversation simply stopped. He kissed her the way he did everything, with deliberate and focused care, and she kissed him back with her hands on either side of his face, and the cold air around them and the mountains watching from the distance. And when they finally moved apart, both of them somewhat breathless in the dry winter air, he looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something open and younger than his usual self, something that looked like wonder. "I have wanted to do that," he said, "for about 2 months. "I know," she said. "I've been watching you not do it." He laughed, a real laugh, and she realized she had not heard him laugh outright before, and it was worth every careful, patient week of getting here. "You are extraordinary, Grace Ramsey," he said. "I've had to be," she said simply, and he looked at her with the clear, clean understanding of a person who knows what she means without needing it explained, and that understanding was itself a kind of love. She thought he should perhaps understand about her former marriage before things went further, because she was not a woman who withheld important information. And so she told him about Edward Ramsey one evening by the fire in her sitting room, the whole of it without softening, the charm and the disappointment and the slow erosion of her confidence in her own judgment, and then the divorce and the way it had felt shameful in Missouri, even when she knew it was right. She told it plainly and without performing either bitterness or acceptance, simply as the true account of something that had happened. He listened the way he always listened, with the complete, contained attention that she had come to understand as one of the things she loved most about him. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He was a fool," Gilbert said. "He wasn't particularly intelligent, no," she agreed. "I mean he was a fool to take what he had and treat it without care," Gilbert said, and he was looking at her with a directness that matched her own, and she felt the truth of what he meant all the way through her. "What about you?" she asked. "You've never said much about before Dusty Creek." He was quiet for a longer moment. "There was a woman in Kansas," he said finally, "when I was 26. We had an understanding, or I thought we did. She married someone else, a man with an established farm and prospects that were more immediate than mine were at the time." He said it without visible bitterness, but she heard the older, quieter shadow of it beneath the matter-of-fact telling. "I was not enough of what she needed yet." "Yet," she said. "I was more hopeful than about the possibility of yet," he said. "By the time I had what she'd needed, she'd been gone 8 years. And then you came to Dusty Creek and were the most hated man in the valley." He looked at her sideways with the faint curve of his mouth, "according to the general consensus. For being right about the water rights and the school fees and not attending harvest dances. The harvest dance situation weighs most heavily on the population, I think." "Do you dance?" she asked. He considered this seriously. "I know the mechanics," he said. "I cannot claim grace in the execution." "That is my name," she pointed out, and he laughed again, and she tucked the sound of it away somewhere warm inside her. February brought the annual Dusty Creek Valley Winter Social, a gathering at the town hall that was distinguished from the Christmas gathering primarily by the inclusion of dancing, and the fact that attendance was even more universal, because winter had been long and people were restless for any form of collective relief. Grace intended to go. She mentioned it to Gilbert in the way of information rather than invitation, and he was quiet with his coffee cup. "I could go," he said in the tone of a man testing the weight of a statement. She looked at him carefully. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I'm considering whether I want to." She waited. "Would it be useful to you if I went?" he asked, and the way he framed it, the consideration for her position in the community rather than his own comfort, made her love him in a very particular way in that moment. "I think," she said, "that it would be good for you and possibly good for some people's ideas about you, and I would like to be there with you if you want to come." He came. The effect of Gilbert Garrison appearing at the winter social was something Grace observed with quiet, amused interest. He arrived with her, which was itself the source of approximately 2 hours of subsequent valley conversation, and he was clean and carefully dressed, and he shook hands with people who had not spoken to him in years with a manner that was neither apologetic nor aggressive, simply direct and civil. He talked to Pete Dudley about horses, and to young Mr. Davies the schoolmaster about the new reading books, and to one of the Mendez sons, a young man named Raphael who was about 20, and who shook Gilbert's hand with a warmth that suggested the Mendez family held a different view of him than Thomas Aldrich's camp did. Thomas Aldrich himself was there, as expected, and he looked at Gilbert and Grace together with an expression that contained several calculations, and he nodded once, with the stiff courtesy of a man acknowledging a situation he cannot currently change. Gilbert nodded back with perfect equanimity. Grace smiled at Aldrich with a sweetness that was entirely genuine and which seemed to confuse him somewhat. The dancing started. Gilbert looked at her with an expression of resigned determination. "I warned you," he said. "I'll lead if necessary," she told him, and he gave her the look and she laughed and they went onto the floor. He was not graceful. He was also not as bad as he believed himself to be, moving with a careful concentration that was actually rather endearing. And when she laughed at a misstep and he laughed too, rather than withdrawing into dignity, old Mabel Hutchins, watching from a chair along the wall, put her hand over her mouth and then put it down again with a particular expression. They danced twice, badly and joyfully, and then stood together at the edge of the room and talked with people who were, Grace could see, revising their understanding of Gilbert Garrison in real time. Not all of them. Thomas Aldrich's sons looked over from across the hall with expressions that suggested they were not revising anything. But most of the valley, given the opportunity to see a man they had decided about in a different context, seemed to find the decision worth reconsidering. Walking home in the cold February night, she put her hand through his arm and he covered it with his free hand, and they walked up the hill road in the dark with the stars enormous overhead, and she thought, "This is what I came here for." Not this specifically, not this man and this night, because she had not known either was possible when she set out from Missouri, but something true and solid and hers, built with her own hands and her own choices, in a place where no one knew the history she was starting over from. "I think that went tolerably," Gilbert said. "Better than tolerably," she said. "People are going to talk, but now they're going to talk about something more accurate. They'll still think I'm difficult." "You are a little difficult," she said affectionately. "That's different from being bad." He was quiet for a moment. "You said that once before, early on, I remember. You had just arrived, you'd been warned by everyone." "I had. And you still offered coffee." "Your fence line looked lonely," she said, and she felt him laugh beside her, the warmth of it against her shoulder. March came to Dusty Creek Valley with the particular agony and promise of early spring, the mud and the cold mornings, and the lambs in the south meadow of Gilbert's spread, and the first green things pushing up along the creek bank. Grace planted her kitchen garden with careful attention, choosing what would grow in this soil and this altitude rather than what she had grown in Missouri, learning the valley's specific character as a gardener rather than a passerby. She and Gilbert talked, in the unhurried and inevitable way of two people who have decided that the other person is the most interesting thing in their daily landscape, about everything. about land and weather and books, about his breeding program for the cattle and her ideas for expanding the garden into a proper vegetable patch that might supply the general store, about the history of the territory, which they had both read about and which Gilbert had opinions about regarding the treatment of the Apache and Navajo people who had lived in this land long before any of them, opinions she found she shared entirely. He had seen things in his years of working across the territories that she had only read about, and he spoke about the displacement of indigenous peoples, not with the comfortable distance of someone recounting history, but with the direct, uncomfortable clarity of someone who had witnessed its ongoing aftermath and considered it a serious injustice. She listened to this with the focused attention she tried to give to things that mattered, and they talked about it seriously and honestly in a way that made her feel, again, that she had found someone whose mind worked in a direction she could walk alongside. He asked her, one April evening when the windows were open for the first time to let in the mild spring air, whether she planned to stay in Dusty Creek for good. She looked at him across the supper table, at his serious, careful face in the lamplight. "Do you want me to?" she asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation, and the simplicity of it was more moving than any elaborate declaration would have been. "Then yes," she said, "I'm staying." He nodded as though that settled something fundamental, and then he said, "I would like to ask you something, and I would like you to know that I have thought about it carefully and not impulsively, because I do not do things impulsively as a general practice." "I know," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not immediately. I'm not asking for immediately. I'm asking if you would be willing to consider it as a direction we're going." She looked at him steadily. "I have been considering it as a direction we're going since about February," she said honestly. Something in his face shifted, that open, wondering thing she had seen in January, the face beneath the careful face. "Then we're agreed." "We're agreed," she said, "though eventually you're going to have to ask me properly." "I'll work up to it," he said, and the corner of his mouth curved, and she shook her head at him with affection so complete it felt like its own kind of home. He asked her properly on a Saturday in May, on the rise behind her property where the view of the valley went all the way to the southern mountains, in the late afternoon light that turned everything golden. He had no ring because he had not yet had the opportunity to go to Santa Fe, and he said so straightforwardly, and she said she did not care about the ring. He asked her with his hat in his hands and his dark eyes direct on hers, and a formality that was somehow both very serious and very much his particular way of being. She said yes. They told old Mabel Hutchins because she would tell everyone else, and because she had come around considerably and deserved the courtesy of knowing first. Mabel cried, which surprised everyone including Mabel, and she told Grace she was glad that girl had not listened to her warning back in October, which Grace took as a generous acknowledgement. They were married in June of 1883 in the small Dusty Creek church, a quiet ceremony with Pete Dudley standing up as Gilbert's witness, because Pete had come to think well of him over the winter's gradual reacquaintance, and Mabel Hutchins standing with Grace because she had decided they were friends and announced it as a fact, which Grace accepted with real warmth. The preacher, who was a new man replacing the one with the sister married to the disgraced Beckwith, was a mild-mannered young fellow who married them with evident sincerity. Gilbert had ridden to Santa Fe in April and returned with a ring, a simple silver band set with a small turquoise stone the color of the desert sky, which was more beautiful to Grace than any diamond could have been because it was specific to where they were and who he was, an absolutely Gilbert Garrison choice in the best possible way. She wore it, and she looked at it in the sunlight after the ceremony, and felt the warm, solid truth of having chosen well. They merged their households gradually and thoughtfully, as befitted two people who had lived independently long enough to have developed specific ways of organizing things that needed to be respected in the combining. He moved into her house, which was the better house in her assessment and which he agreed with after a frank discussion, and they spent a companionable week rearranging furniture and shelves to make room for his books and his surveying tools and his particular collection of practical objects, which were numerous and well-made. His kitchen things came over. His books filled a new shelf they built together along the south wall of the sitting room, a project that took 2 weekends and produced only one actual argument about whether a shelf should be level to the eye or to the level instrument, which he won on technical grounds, and she conceded with dignity. The cattle operation he ran from next door, where his barn and outbuildings remained, and she began to seriously develop the vegetable enterprise she had been thinking about since March. By July, she had a substantial garden and a productive negotiation with Horace at the general store for weekly produce. And by August, she had expanded the arrangement to include 2 other families in the valley and was growing more than she'd originally planned. The valley's opinion of Gilbert Garrison shifted, not all at once and not entirely, but perceptibly. His marriage to Grace, whom the valley had largely decided to like after sufficient exposure to her combination of warmth and clarity, gave people a new frame through which to see him. His presence at community events, still infrequent but no longer non-existent, gave people opportunities to revise decisions made on limited information. Young Rafael Mendez, who now worked part of the season on Gilbert's cattle operation, and who was one of the best young ranch hands in the valley, spoke well of him to anyone who asked, and the Mendez family's respect carried weight with the families who had not previously been in Aldrich's camp. Thomas Aldrich remained cold and formal and did not extend any olive branch, and Gilbert did not seek one from him, and Grace found this entirely acceptable. There were some things that did not need to be resolved by everyone being friends. The land rights were clear and documented, and the water rights were legally settled, and Aldrich's influence in the valley was slowly and naturally redistributing as younger families established themselves and found they could negotiate directly rather than through his intermediation. September brought the harvest season with its particular fullness, the long golden days of late summer turning into the sharp, brilliant days of early autumn, and Grace stood in her garden in the evenings and felt the profound satisfaction of a year completed in a place that was genuinely hers. She was pregnant. She discovered this in late September and sat with the knowledge for 2 days in the particular private way she sat with important things before she was ready to share them, and then she told Gilbert over breakfast on a Tuesday morning with the directness that was fundamental to who she was. He looked at her across the table. He set his coffee cup down very carefully. And then he said with a quiet and absolute sincerity, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. He got up and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind very carefully and rested his cheek against her hair, and she could feel the contained emotion in him, the full force of something he was not quite sure how to contain within the usual careful management of himself. "I did not," he said very quietly, "expect to have this." She put her hands over his. "Neither did I," she said. "I'm glad we do." The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the most contented winter Grace had ever known, which was a thing she would have found difficult to believe a year earlier when she had arrived in Dusty Creek with her wagon and her trunk and her coffee pot, a woman starting over who had no idea what she was starting toward. She was warm and comfortable and well, the pregnancy progressing smoothly, and Gilbert was attentive in his particular way, not hovering or overprotective but present and practical and careful, making sure the woodbox was always full and the paths were cleared of ice, and that the good things she liked to eat for supper were available. He talked about the baby with a contained and genuine wonder that she found deeply moving. This man who had arranged his life so carefully against expectation, opening now toward something he had not allowed himself to expect. He built a cradle in the barn workshop over the winter months, working on it in the evenings when the day's work was done, and when he brought it into the house in January, sanded smooth and solid and shaped with more care than was strictly necessary. She ran her hands over the wood and felt the love in its making as clearly as if he had said it in words. He said the words anyway, more freely now than he had in the beginning. He was not a man who said them easily or frequently, but when he said them they carried the full weight of a man who did not say things he did not mean, and she valued this over casual fluency. She said them back with equal sincerity and slightly more frequency because she was built that way, and he listened every time with the particular, open attention of someone who is still, at some level, surprised to be loved and still moved by it, and working on believing in the permanence of it. Their son was born in March of 1884, on a cold, clear night with Mabel Hutchins in attendance as Grace had requested, because Mabel had delivered approximately a third of the living population of Dusty Creek Valley and was steady as a stone. It was a long labor but uncomplicated, and the child arrived with the full-voiced announcement of someone who intended to make his presence known. Gilbert was outside in the kitchen being quietly and precisely unable to do anything useful, which Mabel had anticipated and handled by giving him a kettle to keep filled with hot water, a task of no great complexity but sufficient occupation to keep him functional. When Mabel brought him in to meet his son, Grace watched from the bed as this large, careful, complicated man held the infant with absolute focus and tenderness, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Every careful layer of management dissolved completely. "Hello," he said to the baby, in a voice so gentle it barely disturbed the air. The baby stared at him with the wide, unfocused seriousness of the newborn, possibly considering him. "I'm your father," Gilbert said, as though making an important introduction. "I intend to take that seriously." Grace laughed softly from the bed, and he looked up at her with eyes that were not quite dry, which she thought she would keep as one of the private, precious things about this man whom the valley had decided to hate before it knew him. They named the boy James Clarence Garrison, James because Gilbert's own father had been James, and because despite the difficulties of that relationship he wished to honor the man, and Clarence for Grace's uncle whose bequest had brought her here and was therefore responsible for everything good that had followed. James Clarence Garrison was a healthy, determined, loud and curious child who grew through his first year with the vitality of someone who had decided to make up for no time at all. He was broadly adored. Old Mabel carried him around on her visits with the authority of a woman who considers herself a grandmother by appointment. Rafael Mendez, who was now a regular figure at the ranch, was a particular favorite of the boys by the time he was pulling himself upright on the fence rails and investigating everything within reach with indiscriminate thoroughness. The valley continued its slow recalibration of Gilbert Garrison. The following spring, when a dispute arose among three families about the proper dividing of irrigation water from the eastern creek, it was Gilbert who was asked to mediate, his knowledge of the water law and his reputation for scrupulous fairness overcoming any remaining hesitation. He handled it efficiently and without favoritism, and all three families went away with an arrangement they could live with. And afterward Pete Dudley remarked to Grace, with evident satisfaction, that it was funny how a man could be in one place for years without people seeing him clearly, and then one day there he was. Grace agreed that it was funny, and she did not say that she had seen him clearly from approximately the second morning of the coffee invitation, because it would have sounded self-congratulatory, and because what mattered was not that she had been right, but that the valley had arrived where it had. Thomas Aldrich died in the fall of 1885, a heart complaint that had apparently been building for some years. His sons took over the spread and ran it with a competence that was slightly more neighborly than their father's, whether from genuine disposition or from the pragmatic recognition that the valley's social geography had shifted enough that an attitude of entrenched opposition was no longer advantageous. Gilbert attended the funeral as a courtesy, which Grace thought was exactly the right thing and said so, and he had nodded with the quiet acknowledgement of a man who knows what is owed to decency regardless of the history. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1886, smaller and quieter than James had been, but with a precision of attention from her first weeks that made Grace think, with amused recognition, of a certain person in the household. They named her Clara Ruth, Clara for no particular reason except that it suited her from the moment she arrived, and Ruth for Grace's mother, who had died 2 years before Grace left Missouri, and whom she thought of with a gentle, steady grief that was manageable now, and had become something like gratitude for the years they had had. Gilbert with Clara was a thing Grace observed with a love so large it occasionally overwhelmed her in the middle of ordinary moments. This man who had arranged himself for solitude, who had lived in Dusty Creek for 6 years behind shuttered windows and the town's hostility, sitting in the kitchen rocking his daughter with his big scarred hands, and reading to her in his low, deliberate voice from the books on the shelf. The cattle breeding manual as readily as anything else because she didn't mind the subject, and he minded the reading to her, not the content. By the late 1880s, the Garrison property on the northern rise of Dusty Creek Valley had become something quite different from the isolated, shuttered establishment of 6 years prior. The house, properly expanded to accommodate a family, had a new south-facing porch where Grace grew climbing roses in the summer, and where the family had supper outdoors on warm evenings. The cattle operation was the most productive in the valley, run with Gilbert's exacting competence and with Rafael Mendez, now a young man of 25 with his own small property and aspirations, as a valued and trusted part of the enterprise. The kitchen garden had grown into a genuine small commercial operation, supplying the valley's general store and 2 of the other settlements within riding distance, managed by Grace with the combination of practical intelligence and organized energy that she had applied to everything since childhood. James, at 5 years old, was already following his father around the property with a small hat and an expression of serious purpose that made every adult in Dusty Creek fall slightly in love with him. Clara, at 3, was quieter and more watchful, missing nothing, and had a habit of presenting people with small objects she had found and considered interesting: a smooth stone, a feather, a particularly shaped stick, offered with the solemnity of a meaningful gift. Grace stood on the south porch one evening in the early summer of 1888, her coffee cup in both hands in the old habitual way, watching the last light leave the mountains. The valley below was soft and golden. Inside, she could hear Gilbert reading to James from the history of the territory, James's occasional questions interrupting with the determined curiosity he brought to everything, and Clara's small voice asking something she could not quite make out from here. She had started over. She had arrived in a wagon with a battered trunk and a coffee pot, a woman that the valley's most hated man had refused coffee from on the first morning and then accepted on the second, and from that acceptance had grown everything that was now the whole shape of her daily life, which she would not change in any particular. She heard the door behind her and felt him come to stand beside her, close but not touching, the way he sometimes did when he came to see what she was looking at. "They're asking for you inside," he said. "James wants you to confirm something I've told him about the mountains." "What have you told him?" "The truth, as best I know it," he said. "He suspects I might be leaving something interesting out." "He knows you well," she said. She felt him look at her with the side of his attention that she had learned to read as clearly as a direct gaze. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm always thinking. About something specific." She turned to look at him in the evening light, this man who had been behind shuttered windows when she arrived, and who now stood on a porch with roses and 2 children and a coffee pot that was always full, looked at him with the full and focused love that had grown from a morning invitation across a fence into the entire architecture of her present life. "I'm thinking," she said, "that I am very glad I asked you for coffee." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the open, unmanaged expression that she had become the only person in the world who saw regularly, the face he kept for her and the children, the face that was entirely and specifically Gilbert Garrison without any of the careful management that the world generally received. "So am I," he said. "More than I know how to say, which as you are aware is a significant limitation in this case." "You say it well enough," she told him. "I'm still working on it," he said, and he took her coffee cup gently from her hands and set it on the porch rail and put his arms around her in the evening light, and she rested against him with the complete ease of a woman who is exactly where she intended to be. Inside, James called for his mother with the impatient certainty of a 5-year-old who believes the world exists to answer his questions, and Clara's small, precise voice added something that was probably agreement. And the mountains held the last of the light above the valley, and Grace Ramsey Garrison, who had arrived in Dusty Creek with a wagon and a battered trunk and a coffee pot and no particular certainty about what came next, stood on her porch in her husband's arms and felt the beautiful, solid, completed weight of a life built exactly right. She pulled back and looked up at Gilbert. "We should go in," she said. "Your son has questions." "He always has questions," Gilbert said. "He got that from you," she said. "He got it from both of us," he said, and she could not dispute it. They went inside together, into the warm light and the children and the smell of supper and the ongoing conversation that was their life, and the south porch held the last of the evening and the coffee cup and the mountains in the distance, and the gate between the two properties stood open as it had been for years now, its hinge still working perfectly, smooth and solid and made to last. The years settled into the Garrison household the way good years settle, not without difficulty or weather or the ordinary complications of life in a valley that was still a frontier in many of the ways that mattered, but with a foundational ease that came from two people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and kept choosing each other in the daily accumulation of a shared life. James grew into a boy who was his father's son in the directness of his thought and his serious application to whatever he undertook, and his mother's son in the warmth he offered freely to people, and in the precise way he noticed things that others passed by. By the time he was 7, he could identify every breed of cattle on the property and tell you the breeding history of each, and had strong opinions about fence posts that Gilbert found both amusing and genuinely worth consulting on. Clara grew into a girl of such precise and thorough observation that people sometimes found her slightly unnerving until they understood that the observation was not critical but genuinely interested, that she was simply taking everything in with the full attention she apparently gave to everything. She was going to be something specific and remarkable, Grace thought, though what exactly was not yet clear and would not be forced. There came a spring, 1890, when Grace discovered she was pregnant again with the same quiet, private certainty of the first time, and she told Gilbert over breakfast on a Tuesday morning because some patterns are worth keeping. He set down his coffee cup with the same careful deliberateness. He came around the table. He held her with his cheek against her hair. "Hello again," he said, which was what he had taken to saying for moments he did not quite have the full words for, and she understood it completely. The child born that November was another boy, smaller and more tranquil than James had been, but with an infectious and easy joy about him that manifested almost from the beginning, a baby who smiled early and thoroughly, and who made strangers on the street feel immediately that he was glad to see them specifically. They named him Eli Thomas, Eli because Grace had always liked the name and Thomas for no Aldrich reason, but for Pete Dudley's given name, which was Thomas Peter, because Pete had become something genuinely close to family over the years and deserved the honor. Pete cried when he heard this, briefly and with some embarrassment, and then composed himself and said they had very good judgment in names, which was as much as any of them could have hoped for from him on an emotional occasion. Dusty Creek Valley moved into the final decade of the 19th century with the particular character of a place that is still settling into itself, still becoming what it will be when it is fully formed. The railroad had come through the southern end of the valley in 1887, bringing changes that were complicated and not all welcome, but that were also undeniably real, connecting Dusty Creek to markets and supplies and information that had previously taken weeks to arrive. Gilbert had watched the railroads coming with the thoughtful assessment he brought to anything that would permanently alter the land and the patterns of life on it, and he had adjusted his cattle operation to take advantage of the market access, while maintaining the careful stewardship of the range land that he considered non-negotiable. Grace's produce enterprise had grown with the railroad connection into something that now supplied towns 2 days east and south of Dusty Creek, a small but real operation that she ran with the combination of organizational clarity and warm personal relationships with her buyers that made it work. She had hired 2 women from the valley to help with the growing and the packing, both of them young mothers who needed the income and who proved to be excellent workers, and she paid them fairly and on time and treated them like the competent adults they were, which as far as she was concerned was simply how you ran a thing if you wanted it to run well. She was 40 years old in 1891 and felt more herself than she had at any previous point in her life, which she found remarkable and worth paying attention to. In the spring of that year, Rafael Mendez came to the kitchen door on a Sunday afternoon with a particular expression that Grace recognized immediately as a man who has something important to ask and is organizing his approach to it. She poured him coffee and waited, and he sat across her kitchen table and explained that he had been saving for 3 years and had enough now to make a serious offer on the Hartley parcel in the Eastern Valley, 40 acres with good water access, and he wanted to know if Gilbert would consider extending him a loan for the balance. She called Gilbert in from the barn. Gilbert sat down and listened to Raphael with the complete, focused attention that was one of his most valuable qualities in situations like this, and he asked 3 careful questions about the parcel and the finances and the plan, and then he said yes, the loan at a fair rate of interest and with the Hartley parcel as security. Because the young man had earned the trust by years of demonstrable competence and honesty, and because the best thing you could do with what you had built was sometimes to help someone else build something. Raphael shook his hand and then Grace's hand, and then had to collect himself before he left, and the look on his face was something she thought about afterward, the look of a young man who had been told by the world in various ways that the resources available to him were limited, encountering someone who disagreed. The older Garrison children, James at 9 and Clara at 7, were getting their education from the Valley School that Mr. Davies ran with a genuine and loving competence, and from their parents at home, in the particular and useful ways that children learn from parents who think carefully about the world. James had decided he wanted to be a rancher and a lawyer, which Gilbert pointed out were compatible ambitions, and Clara had developed a passion for mathematics that Grace quietly and deliberately fed with every book she could find on the subject, because she had been told at Clara's age that mathematics was not for girls, and she had spent the intervening decades noticing that this was nonsense. There were years of good harvests and one hard year, 1893, when a drought that started in summer dried the Eastern Creek to a trickle and stressed the range, and required the kind of careful management that either broke you or taught you precisely what you were made of. It did not break the Garrison household. Gilbert's breeding program, built over years on the principle that good stock is resilient stock, showed its value in drought years when weaker cattle operations were selling off at distressed prices, and he was able to hold and maintain. Grace's garden required hauling water by hand that summer, work that was brutal and which she did anyway because the produce contracts kept 2 families employed, and she did not intend to default on either. James, now 11, hauled water alongside her without being asked, working in the morning heat with a focused, determined silence that made her proud in a way she could not quite put into words. The drought broke in the fall and the valley recovered, and the eastern creek ran clear and full by spring of 1894, and the year that followed was one of the most productive they had known. There came an evening in the spring of 1895 when Grace and Gilbert sat on the south porch, the older children inside doing their schoolwork and Eli, now 4, asleep since an hour before sunset, because he was a child who applied himself to sleep with the same wholehearted enthusiasm he brought to everything else. The valley was quiet in the long spring twilight. The mountains to the north still held snow on their highest places, white lines against the sky that would be there until July. Gilbert had his coffee. She had her coffee. The roses on the porch rail were coming in, the small early buds that would be full and open by June. The valley below was soft and beginning to green. She had been thinking, in the way she had of thinking through things she had already mostly decided and was now simply arriving at, about what they had made here, in the 13 years since she had arrived in a wagon with her battered trunk and asked a shuttered-windowed neighbor over for coffee. The most hated man in the valley, they had called him, the man you do not go near. She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had built a good life with careful and honest labor, and then built a larger one with her, who read histories and cattle breeding manuals to small children with equal seriousness, who had mediated 3 valley disputes in the past 5 years with a fairness that even his former opponents acknowledged, who had lent Rafael Mendez the money to buy his own land, and who checked every month that the water in the eastern creek was running at the level the legal agreement specified, not because he was suspicious, but because accuracy mattered to him and always would. "Gilbert," she said. He looked at her. "Do you remember the first morning? When I called across the fence, you asked me for coffee," he said. "You said no." "I said no," he confirmed. "And then you came the next day. The coffee was extraordinary," he said with the very faint curve of his mouth. "I made a pragmatic decision. Just the coffee," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the evening light, this woman who had arrived and seen him clearly from the beginning, who had not been moved by the valley's opinion, and had not been put off by his own considerable difficulty, who had built alongside him with her own intelligence and her own will and her own specific and irreplaceable self. "Not just the coffee," he said. She smiled at him, and he smiled back, the real smile, the full one she had first seen in his kitchen on a Christmas evening 12 years ago. They sat together in the spring twilight on their south porch while the roses came in, and the mountains held their last snow, and the children's voices came through the window, James asking Clara something mathematical, and Clara's precise answer, and Eli's small voice requesting something from someone, the ongoing orchestral sound of a household full and alive. The valley below Dusty Creek spread green and wide and real in the evening light, and Grace Ramsey Garrison held her coffee cup in both hands in the old habitual way, and felt the solid, complete, deeply rooted happiness of a woman who had driven a wagon into an unknown place with nothing much to lose and had somehow, through one honest offer of coffee across a fence line, found everything.